So, in today's video, which is a little long, we will try to recap all the concepts we have covered so far in network biology, so that all the concepts are fixated before we move on to the next topics. So, we will look at the basic network parameters, centrality measures, network models, communities, motives and so on. So, welcome. Today we will take a look at network biology, a recap of what we have covered over the last few classes in the context of network biology. So, what are all the concepts that we have studied so far? So, what is network biology? It is nothing but graph theory, applied to biology. We started with the history of graph theory, looking at Euler's classic contribution of showing that there is no Eulerian path in the bridges of Königsberg. But beyond that, we started seeing why we need to study graphs in biology. It turns out that many biological problems map nicely back onto graphs. Can you give me some examples of problems that map back onto graphs in biology? So, you can have protein interaction networks, so maybe I will start showcasing the problem itself. So, maybe we want to do path finding in metabolic networks. What else? Gene regulatory networks. So, there are different types of networks, I will just say GRNs. So, the different types of networks, and a problem that we did not go into detail, but is quite important in the concept in the context of graph theory is genome assembly. How do you assemble genomes? This again involves graph theory. So, there are many problems that heavily involve graph theory. We are of course more interested in some of these problems, and even there we actually did not look at pathfinding and so on, but this is a good example. A protein interaction network, what can we find from a protein interaction network? You can study various network properties. You can look at what is the average separation between two nodes in a network, what is the maximum separation between two nodes in a network, is the network very clustered, does it have a particular kind of degree distribution and so on, right. So, we then went and studied several important network parameters, right. So, and network properties. So, we looked at things like density, right, which is essentially the fraction of edges that are actually in the graph. Then we looked at degree, most importantly degree distribution, the concept of clustering coefficient, and various centrality measures. In fact, we discussed closeness and betweenness and so on, but there are many other centrality measures including page rank, there is something known as eigenvector centrality and many more, right. There are different centrality measures that are commonly used, and many of them have a biological implication as well, and I have shared some material corresponding to those, right. So, maybe we can quickly visit some of these things. So, what is degree? It is the number of neighbors that any node has, and for a directed graph some of these definitions slightly change. You may want to talk about in degree and out degree and things like that. Very important concept of course is that of degree distribution, right, which is a plot of how degree changes for different nodes. So, the number of nodes is degree k or probability of finding a node with degree k versus k. So, if the graph looks like this, then it is a power law. If it looks like this, it is something. You can have different kinds of degree distributions. Right. What is clustering coefficient? It tries to measure how clustered the network is, and the simplest cluster is this. So, it essentially counts the number of triangles in the neighborhood of a particular node. So, if this is a node and it is part of a bigger graph, you find that this node x has 1, 2, 3, 4 neighbors, right. So, there are a total of possible 4 choose 2 edges between those nodes, but how many of them exist? You have 1 here, you have 2 here, is that it? Yeah. So, this is the clustering coefficient of this node, which is basically 1 by 6 or 2 by 6, 1 by 3, right. And various centrality measures. Particularly important is betweenness centrality. We also looked at edge betweenness and co-betweenness. These are other useful concepts. So, these are all the basic parameters that we can use to characterize a network. Some of these are node properties, some of these are edge properties, some of these are network properties. You can also study network averages, network average clustering coefficient. Diameter is already a network property, right. So, maybe I will say density, diameter, characteristic path length. Characteristic path length is average separation between a pair of nodes in the network, right. So, once we finished looking at these, we then moved over to important network models, and we studied 3 classic models. Erdős-Renyi, Watts, Strogatz, this is what we call random, this is what we call small world, and this is what we call power law, scale free. So, do all networks have to fall into one of these categories? Not necessarily. You might find some partial character. In some region of degrees you might find a power law behavior, in another region you might find a small world behavior, and you may not find any perceptible pattern in some other region, right. So, there is a lot of some sort of a misplaced obsession about trying to show that your network is a power law network, right. People just want to show that every biological network is a power law network, and typically you might end up with a degree distribution that looks somewhat like this in a log plot, right. This need not be a power law, right. Okay. This would be a perfect power law, but you might have deviations from it which is not unusual, right, or you might find a nice power law in this domain and then it just changes after that, right. So, you have to be careful about claiming that your network is a power law network, but what is more important is the fact that are there hubs in your network, right, is there good clustering in your network, right. And we also studied how to generate these networks, right, and we tried to code them. I think we should try doing that again because it is sometimes can be a little tricky. So, how do you generate an Erdős-Renyi random network? If we were to write a MATLAB function, it will look something like function A equals always, right. You want to basically create the adjacency matrix corresponding to any given network. Of n comma p. And then what will you do? You will just try to construct an adjacency matrix such that an entry in the adjacency matrix will be non-zero if it is, if you generated a random number that is less than equal to p, right. So, you generate several random numbers, right, and whenever it is less than p, for every edge in fact, whenever it is less than p, you put a 1 there, otherwise you let it remain a 0.
So we will do only upper triangular and make it.
You can do something like that, right. So, you may have to maybe scale p down or something like that, right. So, you have to make only half the edges with the upper triangular and then just make a copy of that, right. So, that is how you would generate. And how will the degree distribution look like? Poisson, because you are counting the number of successes of something, an event that has probability p. What is the event that has probability p? The probability of establishing a link, right, and you are now counting the number of links or the number of successes, which is equivalent to a binomial or a Poisson. So, now this is for 1. In the second case, you start with a regular lattice n comma k. You now have to assemble this adjacency matrix. How do you assemble this adjacency matrix? What you know is, you have a regular lattice of this sort where every node is connected to k nearest neighbors on either side, right, and we can then show that the clustering coefficient is basically we did see an example previously, right, where the clustering coefficient for a network with 10,3 or something like that, right. But this gives you only a regular lattice which now has to be rewired with some probability beta or p, whatever, right. So, beta equals 0 is this regular lattice, beta equals 1 will be a completely randomized network. Somewhere in between is where you find what are known as the small world properties, which are basically, what are the small world properties? So, LWS right. And how would you ascertain these? So, you have to create multiple networks, right. You create multiple ER networks using say this function, and you will get a plot, right. So, this is LER and this is some probability of observing, count, frequency, whatever, and you might find that LWS lies somewhere here. But if this were actually the clustering coefficient plot, CWS might actually lie somewhere here, right, because it is much greater than CER. and the mean value of CER is of course somewhere here.
Sir, does the rewiring also similar to advanced binary? I will go to edge, I will generate a probability. If that probability is greater than
Beta, you rewire it. How do you rewire it?
just remove and put it in.
Pick a random node that it is not connected to and rewire. So, sever a link and connect it across the table essentially. So, let us say we sever this link. Okay, let us say we remove out this link and then we connect it here. It is not a neighbor already, but that is where we try and connect it.
The new link should not be connected to both nodes.
No, one. So, you have one node is kept constant, you detach the other edge, plug it somewhere else across the table. So, only pick a node where it is not already connected to. So, now think of how will you write the rewiring code, right. It is quite important to start thinking in terms of how do you code this up as well, right, especially for some of you may have a biology background and are not that familiar with programming. So, you need to start thinking about how you code each one of these things, right. So, the first thing is what should my output look like? Your rewired matrix should essentially, your rewired graph should essentially be represented as a rewired matrix, an adjacency matrix. So, you have to now figure out how to generate an adjacency matrix such that you have rewired the original graph or its corresponding adjacency matrix. So, what is it that you do? You first construct this regular graph, regular lattice, and now pick a node, pick an edge from that, and with a probability beta you now decide if I want to rewire it or not. So, you pick the edge and rewire it. If it satisfies the probability beta, just like what we were doing in the first case, you then rewire it, but while rewiring just make sure that you attach to some node that you are not already connected to.
So, the probability should be less than beta, right?
Less than beta. So, that way you can generate a rewired network, right. So, the next thing that we will look at is function A equals what will my inputs be here? Initial graph, very good. So, I would start with an A naught or let us maybe call it G, an initial graph G, right. Then number of incoming nodes and also very good number of, it can be optional, number of edges that you add in every round, every iteration, every incoming node, how many edges does it make with the existing graph. So, if we started you could start with a graph like this even, and let us say you have 2 incoming nodes which make 2 edges each, right. So, you will now have to connect this, you may end up connecting it to this, and then this you may end up connecting to this, and as another edge could be here and another edge could be here, something of this sort. So, after every iteration you will be adding mk edges, I mean k edges, right. At the end you will have mk new edges that have been added, right. What happens, think about it, when let us say m is 100 and k equals 1, what will be the clustering coefficient of the graph? It is not something that you would normally be able to answer easily, but because k equals 1, it is a special case and I think you may be able to easily see what happens. If every incoming node, and let us say we start off with this is your G initial graph, every incoming node makes one edge with the existing nodes. So, what will be the clustering coefficient? You will find that there is no way triangles can be created, because for a triangle to be created you need one node to make at least more than one edge, you need 2 edges, right, and they should also connect to two nodes which are already neighbors, right. So, if I am going to just add one node like this, I am going to make some chains, but on the other hand if I were going to add two nodes, I make a few triangles, not everything results in triangles, but you will have some more clustering, right, but Barabashi-Albert graphs do show clustering. So, this addition of one node is a sort of very simplifying assumption. So, Barabashi-Albert graphs do show clustering, as you can see for yourself. So, are you getting a better picture now of how you go about building the different?
Case 1 they will show clustering. If case 1 they should not show.
There is no clustering. So, this is k equals 2. A hub is not a cluster, right. So, one thing could be, as you know, that is the next thing we will get to. You will have communities in graphs. So, there is a difference between communities and clusters, right. We sometimes use the term interchangeably, but usually when we say cluster, this is what we call a cluster, at least in the sense of clustering coefficient, right. But the terms are often used loosely, right. You can talk about communities or clusters, or so usually it is called clustering in graphs, right. Is there any clustering in a given graph, right. And how do you go about identifying communities in graphs? One way we looked at was using hierarchical clustering, right. You first connect the nodes that are closest to each other based on some metric. So, you can have some metric wij which tells you how close two nodes are. Maybe the one example we looked at was trying to compute the number of node independent paths between a pair of nodes, right. So, if you have A, B, C, D, E, F and A, X, Y, F, these are two node independent paths. There are no paths, no nodes that are shared between these two paths, right. So, that could be wij, and you could use that to start grouping vertices together and you will generate a dendrogram of some sort. And so on, and depending upon where you cut this dendrogram, if you cut it here you will get 7 clusters, if you cut it here you get a single cluster, if you cut it here you will get 3 clusters. They used interchangeably. So, one thing, so the moment you understand the concept of clustering coefficient you can then start looking at communities and clusters similar, right. But the thing is, you may find that this is actually truly a cluster, right. This is a cluster or community. The words are often used interchangeably, particularly in the biological community, but see this may be a cluster by virtue of its isolated function and so on, but if you see there are not enough intra community edges, no. I mean there are few, but it is not this tight. Well, you use all these, so this is the hub, this is not a hub, right. So, the hub is only the central node. So, you call it a hub and spoke formation kind of thing, right. So, but in general all these terms are used loosely: module, cluster, community, right. So, I think this is more preferred in graph theory literature and so on, whereas this is somewhat more preferred in biological literature. That is arbitrary. What other concepts did we discuss? Modularity. So, this is modularity. Modularity, community detection is the same thing. Perturbations, right. So, how do you quantify perturbations to any network? Right. And I think you should try to study all of these things. How do you study perturbation? You start with any graph, right. It could be a ER graph, it could be a WS graph, it could be a BA graph, right, and perturb it, which means what? Remove nodes and edges. And a typical study to do is fraction of nodes removed on the x axis, y axis is some parameter that you are studying. It could be L, it could be dia, it could be clustering coefficient, whatever, right. And you might find something like this, or rather something like this, and so on, right. This is something you should study. Let us try to do this in a lab session. You first have to write codes to generate these basic networks, and then knock out something and then study. Then finally, we look at motifs. Motifs are nothing but subgraphs, rather over represented subgraphs, rather statistically significantly over represented subgraphs, right. So, as an example, are there any motifs in this graph? But this is why you need to understand the difference between count and statistical significance, right. So, just because something is abundant, has high frequency, does not mean it is statistically significant, right, because what do we mean by statistical significance? When compared to a null model. Null model is rewired versions of this network, and this network can't even be rewired. All the edges already exist, right. So, how many edges are there in this network? Every node has 4 outgoing edges. So, how will you rewire it? You will rewire it to something like this. This is the same thing, right. So, all realizations of this network will be the same. So, none of your motifs can be statistically significant. This is of course an extreme example to drive home the concept, but in practice you will see that you have to do a statistical significance. So, what ways of statistical significance, what other measures of statistical significance can you do? A simple way to do is to look at the Z score. What is Z score? Right. You have a population, you take its mean, and you now take a particular observation, you do x minus mu by sigma, and if this is really high, you will find that maybe it is going to be statistically significant, or you can do a parametric test or a non-parametric test, typically a non-parametric test, to try and identify how, whether your observation is your motif is statistically significant. So, in practice how would you do this? It is very similar to what we were doing for out here, right. You need to plot what is the frequency distribution of your motif of interest in the randomized graphs, right. You start with a network, you randomize it multiple times and then you compute how many times am I observing this feed forward loop or by fan or any of these particular motifs, and then you go and study, you go and see how many times it occurs in your real network, maybe it is your E. coli gene regulatory network, and then you can say that it seems that feed forward loops are over represented, statistically significantly over represented in the E. coli gene regulatory network compared to random rewired versions. So, there is a tool called FAN-mod which helps you find motifs. It will basically give you a long table of this sort. Here it will say what is the motif, and here it will tell you the random distribution. Say and maybe you know a z score as well and so on. So, would you say this is statistically significant? It is 35 plus or minus 5.3 or whatever. So, it is a tight distribution around 35 and the real guy is way off, it is 125 which is much greater than. So, you will say that in real, so this is a statistically significant motif, and let us say there is another motif. And you find that the n rand is you will say that this is. So, this FAN-mod tool basically generates some HTML files which will give you tables such as these. You can throw any random any network at FAN-mod, it works only on Windows though. Okay. So, I think this more or less brings us to the end of network biology. There are many other interesting concepts. You can look at dynamics on networks, you can look at percolation in networks, different kinds of perturbations. In fact, maybe one thing we should discuss is how do you really damage a network? What is the most effective perturbation you can do to a network? So, the one concept I did not review yet was lethality centrality hypothesis. What does this state?
If we remove after removing
high centrality nodes are more likely to be lethal, right, and this could come from either degree or betweenness. So, there is a strategy to knock out these networks. So, people evaluated strategy. There is a classic paper by Peter Home, I think it is 2002. I have posted this paper. So, what they did was they tried two strategies: degree betweenness So, what this means is they tried degree and used only the initial degrees, right. So, initially you will have some degrees, right. So, some node will have a degree of 100, some node will have a degree of 95, 90, 80, 20, whatever. So, you remove based on that, or you could recalculate degree after every removal. When you remove the node with degree 90, it might take away a few other edges from the other nodes, right. So, the degree distribution will actually change after you remove the first node, right. So, that is recalculation. Similarly, you can compute betweenness centrality initially, rank the nodes based on betweenness centrality and start removing the nodes in the order of betweenness centrality. The other option is you remove the first node with the highest betweenness centrality, recompute betweenness in the entire network and now start removing the node with the highest betweenness centrality recursively. It turns out that what I have underlined was the strongest perturbation. You remove nodes based on betweenness centrality and recalculate at every iteration, it ensured that the network disintegrated the fastest. How would you measure network disintegration again? Measure characteristic path length. How does characteristic path length change, or how does diameter change? Yes, you can also use this pairwise disconnectivity that we were talking about in a previous class. Start removing the topmost degree, then the next highest, next highest, next highest.
They are not recalculating.
Not recalculating the degrees. You have one, you initially compute a degree vector, you use that as your list priority list for removing nodes. The other option is to recalculate after every perturbation.
What if we do the recalculation for degree itself?
Yeah, we recalculate degree.
So why is betweenness even coming in there?
No, that's another strategy.
Okay.
So you can either use rank nodes based on degree. Well, I could add 100 other things to this. I could say page rank, I could say closeness centrality, I could say eigenvector centrality, so on and so forth. Right? All those are potential strategies, and you may want to evaluate how good these are as strategies. So I hope you had a good revision of all the network related concepts in today's video, right from the network parameters to the different types of network models, communities and so on. In the next video, we will do a lab wherein we visit some of these network models.